Hey guys, in today's lesson we're going to go ahead and continue working on graphing, okay? Now just a little backtrack. Yesterday we talked about graphing sine, and then today we're going to focus on graphing some cosine. It's just much the same way. Now we get the graph of this guy from the unit circle. So remember that now in trigonometry we represent the x-coordinate by the cosine, and we represent the sine coordinate by the y. So it's no longer xy, it's now cosine theta, sine theta. And then this guy here, our x-axis, okay, is represented no longer by just what we normally think as the x-axis, but these are the radian, these are the angles. Okay, so 0 degrees or 0 pi, and then 90 degrees, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and then back to 2 pi. So one turn around this circle gives us this wave, and we call this one cycle or one period because it takes one turn around the circle to complete the wave. Okay, so now when we graph the cosine wave, we're going to start at 1. So when it's 0 degrees or 0 radians, we start at 1. And then from there, when we get to pi over 2, we notice here, we have 0. Okay, so then when we get to pi, we're at -1. And then when we get to 3 pi over 2, we go back to 0. And then back, we start at 1. So we have this pattern. So we start at amplitude, midline, amplitude, midline, and then amplitude. And so you notice this continual pattern. Now remember, the sine starts off at 0, but cosine starts at 1. Okay, so let me go ahead and just recap just one problem from yesterday. Sometimes your professors will use this. You'll see sine theta. And that's just the same thing as saying this x values right here. So excuse me. So now when we see 4 sine of theta, it's the same thing as 4 sine of x. So let's go ahead and graph that, okay? So you want to go ahead and set this up first, okay? Your tools that you're going to be needing. So first thing, midline. What's a midline? Well, the number that's to the far right by itself. Sometimes it'll be out in the front, but usually it's the one by itself here. So -1. So that means over here, I get to -1. Here's -1. That's going to be my new midline, okay? So I'm just going to do a dotted line. Okay? Here's -1. Next, my amplitude. What's my amplitude? It's the number that's in front of the sine or the cosine. In this case, it's 4. That tells you how high it's going to go. So remember, your amplitude is from the midline all the way up to the peak. So this guy here is the amplitude. Same thing here is the amplitude right here, okay? So our amplitude for this one is going to be 4. Our period is going to be 2 pi over the letter b, whatever's in front of the x. Well, here's my x. What's in front of it? Nothing. So it's 1. So it's 2 pi over 1, which is 2 pi. So now that means by the time I get done, I should end up at 2 pi. So let's see here. We start off at 0. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And then 1, 2, 3. So by the time I get over here, this should be 2 pi. Okay? That's what it means. Well, what about these 3? Well, you're gonna take your period and you're gonna divide it into 4, because there's 4 quadrants or 4 sections. So this is the first one, second, third, and then the fourth. So we're gonna divide it by 4, okay? And this ends up being pi over 2. So then this becomes 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, and then you keep counting 3 pi over 2, and then the next one is 4 pi over 2 or 2 pi. So now I got my 4 sections, okay? Now I can essentially start graphing, okay? Now remember, this is sine. So what you want to do is you want to start off at 0 or at the midline. So we're going to start right here. So I'm going to put a dot right here, right there. Do you always start there with sine? Yes, you always start on the midline, okay? Just to make it simple for yourselves. So by the time I get to this first quadrant, I'm going to be up at the amplitude. So the amplitude is 4. So by the time I get to here, I should be at the amplitude. So we're going to count 4. 1, 2, 3, right there, 4. And then, so you start midline, amplitude, then you go back down to the midline. So by the time I get here, I'm at the midline. And then you go down to the amplitude. So right here, we're going to count down 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, right here. And then lastly, we get back up to the midline, which is right here. This is my new midline right there. Okay. So we end up with something that looks like this. Okay. And this goes up and goes down and keeps going. There it is. That's the wave. Now the last thing you have usually is what's called the horizontal shift. Okay. Or sometimes the professors will say the phase shift. Okay. I like to call it the horizontal shift. Now for us, it's whatever's inside this parentheses, the x. So there's nothing really in there, right? There's just an x. So we're just going to take that, set it equal to 0, and you notice we don't get anything. So that means we don't move either left or right. So this would be my final graph. All right. So my hopes is that as we do these, you'll be able to get the hang of how we're doing these. So let's go ahead and see if we can do a few of these. Same thing. Okay. We're doing cosine this time. But notice how I start off everything here. My midline first. What's my midline? It's going to be -3. Okay, there it is. So now, where's -3? 1, 2, -3 is right here. Okay, -3. So I want to do my my new midline. Okay. And here it is. Okay, cool. Now what do? My amplitude. What's my amplitude? Whatever's in front of the cosine. The number 2. Okay, so the amplitude is 2. My period is 2 pi over b. Now for sine and cosine, it's always going to be 2 pi. What's in front of the x? Well, it's pi. Well, that may look a little bit weird, but we're just going to do the same thing as we do normally, 2 pi. So what's pi over pi? Well, that's going to cancel out. You're going to end up with just 2. Now, this may look kind of weird, but we're just going to graph it the same way. So that means by the time I finish one cycle, I'm going to end up at 2. Okay, so let's see here. I know I start off at, let's say this is 0 right here, right? Okay, so then 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So by the time I get over here, I end up at 2. Okay, so now what about these 3? So we're going to take our period, divide it into 4. So we're going to take 2 divided by 4, and that's going to give us 1/2. So that means this is 1/2. This is 2/2. This is 3/2. This is 4/2, or the same thing as 2. So you notice just how we're just continuously counting, and that's it. Yeah, I know it doesn't have the rating angles, but it's perfectly fine, and it's normal. Sometimes that happens. So now let's go ahead and start graphing it. Okay. Remember, we're starting off at cosine. So cosine starts off at the amplitude. So normally with sine, we start off here at the midline, but we're going to start off with the amplitude. What's the amplitude? 2. So from here, we're going to count up 1, 2. All right, here we go. We're going to start right there. And then from there, what are we going to do? We're going to follow the pattern. Amplitude, midline. And then we go down to the amplitude. Well, what's the amplitude? 2. So we're going to go down 2 units. So from the midline, 1, 2, right here. And then go back up to the midline. And then go back up to the amplitude. 1, 2, right there. So you have this kind of wave here. Okay. And let's see if I can be neat with this. Okay. Try to do it nice, smooth, and curved. And that's what you're going to look for in one wavelength, okay? Peak to peak, that's one cycle. Lastly, we're going to take whatever's inside my parentheses per se. Normally, see, you would have something like this. In this case, we don't. We just have pi x. Well, all right, let's take pi x, set that equal to 0, okay? And we solve it. So what do? Well, you just divide by pi. Well, 0 divided by anything is 0. So what does that mean? There's no horizontal shift. I'm not going to move it left or right. Just going to leave it like that. There you go. There's my graph. Now, if let's say I want to make sure I did it correctly, well, remember these are all points. So let's pick a simple one. Let's see. This is -3, -4, -5. Let's pick this guy right here. So this is the point 1/2, comma, -3. Does that make sense? So this is, we say this is 1/2, but we went down -3. So 1/2 is the x. These are the x's per se, and then -3. Okay. So that means when I plug in 1/2 into here, I should end up with -3. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll just do it real quick. 2 times cosine pi. Instead of x, we're going to put 1/2 and then take away 3. So pi times 1/2, well, that's pi over 2. So we're going to have cosine of pi over 2 minus 3. Okay, so we got to do cosine of pi over 2. Well, what is cosine of pi over 2? Well, pi over 2 is right here. What's the cosine? 0. All right, cool. That makes my life easy. So we have 2 times 0 is 0 minus 3. Well, that means y equals -3. And there it is, guys. It makes sense. We did it right. Okay, let's go ahead and do another example. So start off with this, guys. Midline. What's your midline? Whatever number is out to here, to the outside, or sometimes it's in the front. But what's here? There's nothing. All right, so what's the midline? 0. The midline is going to stay right here in the center. What's my amplitude? Whatever's in front of the cosine. Well, there's no number there. So that means the amplitude is 1. Sometimes your professor will say the absolute value of A, which is okay because sometimes the number here is going to be a negative. So that's why they put the absolute value. Okay, but either way, it's 1. The period, 2 pi over b. Okay, what's in front of the b, in front of the x, I'm sorry. Well, there's a 2, so we're going to take 2 pi divided by 2. And that means we're going to end up with pi. So that means by the time I end up here, one cycle or whatever, I should end up at pi. So let's go ahead and draw it. Let's see. Start off at 0. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So by the time we get over here, we should end up at pi. Okay. So what about these three? Okay, so we take our period, our pi, and we divide it into 4 sections, divided by 4. Well, pretty much done for us, so we're going to count 1 pi over 4, and then we go 2 pi over 4, and then we go 3 pi over 4, and then the last one is 4 pi over 4, which is the same thing as pi. But you notice how all I'm doing is counting, and it just solves itself. Lastly, we're going to do a horizontal shift, so we're going to go ahead and just whatever's inside there, we're going to solve it, set it equal to 0. So 2x minus pi over 2, we're going to set that equal to 0. All right, so if I take this guy to the right, the pi over 2 becomes a positive, okay? So we're going to go ahead and divide by 2, okay? Divide by 2, so that becomes a 1. So remember, dividing by 2, okay? So we have pi over 2. Dividing by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/2. But I'll do this the long way, okay? So pi over 2 divided by 2, right? This is the same thing. So remember your process of algorithm for elementary school. You keep it, you change it to multiplication, and you do the reciprocal. So 1/2. So dividing is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of 2 is 1/2. So x is equal to pi over 4. Cool. So that means it's a positive. So that means I'm going to be moving it pi over 4 units to the right. All right. Cool. So now let's go ahead and start graphing our function here, because now I have everything. Remember, this is cosine. So where am I going to start? I'm going to start on the middle. I'm going to start at the amplitude. Cosine starts at the amplitude. Cosine starts at the amplitude. So we're not starting here at the midline. The amplitude. What's the amplitude? 1. So we're going to go up 1 unit. I'm just going to go ahead and say 1 is up here just so it could look a little bit neater and nicer. Okay, so we're saying 1 is there. Now that we're starting at the amplitude for cosine, we're going to go ahead and follow the pattern. Okay, amplitude, midline, and then what? Amplitude. So let's say keep it the same. So go down 1 unit, and then go back up to the midline, and then go back up to the amplitude. Okay, and we get this guy. Okay, here it is. Here it is. There you go. There's my graph. The last thing I got to do is my shift. It's pi over 4 units to the right. So this guy is going to move pi over 4 to the right. So this guy is going to go here. This guy is going to go there. This guy is going to go here. This guy is going to go there. And then this guy is going to go over here. Well, then how do I figure out what this angle is? Well, you just keep counting. 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4. This would be 5 pi over 4. Okay. So then this guy would end up being over here. And then we can just go ahead and connect it. Okay. Try to be as neat as possible. That didn't come out good, but it's okay. And there it is. You see how the graph shifts or moves to the right. And that's it, guys. And then same thing, you can figure it out that this is pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, which is the same thing as pi over 2. So when we get pi over 2, the x value is 0. So that means when I plug in pi over 2 into here, I should get 0. Okay. So let's see that. Cosine 2 times, instead of x, I'm going to put pi over 2 minus pi over 2. Okay. Well, let's see here. 2 pi over 2 minus 1 pi over 2, that's going to give us pi over 2. Okay. 2 take away 1, right? And cosine of pi over 2, what is that? Remember, cosine of pi over 2 is 0. All right, cool. So we did it right. It works. We graphed it right. So let's go ahead and see if we can do a couple more problems, guys. So the next one, same thing. Start off, what's my midline? -1. What's my amplitude? 4. What's my period? 2 pi over b. Okay, what's in front of the x? Well, it's a pi. Okay, so put pi. Divide that, 2 pi divided by pi. Well, that's going to give me 2. Cool. Let's just go ahead and do this part. Take my period, divide it into 4 sections. So that means you're going to have 2 divided by 4. Well, 2 divided by 4 is 1/2. Nice. Last thing, take this guy. Pi x plus 2, set that equal to 0. Now we're going to solve it. So we're going to have pi x is equal to -2. And it looks kind of weird because, you know, you have that pi, but just continue your math. Same thing. Pi is a number, it's a constant. It's irrational, but it is a constant. Divide by pi. Okay. X equals -2 divided by pi. That gives you approximately -0.636. And then it continues on. And that's okay. So that's how much we're going to be moving it to the left. Okay, we're going to be moving it to the left. Okay. Great. So now let's go ahead and start graphing it. So our midline is -1. It's right here. So -1. Make our new midline. Okay, -1. Okay. Let's do our 4 sections. So each one, okay, by the time I get over here, I should end up at 2. So here is 0. So let's go here. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So by the time I get over here, it should be 2. Okay. What about these other 3? I'm going to count by 1/2. So this is 1/2, 2 halves, and then 3 halves. And that one is 4 halves. Cool. Now, I can start graphing it. All right. So remember, cosine starts at the amplitude. What's my amplitude? It's 4. So from here, the amplitude is 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right up here. Cool. Then amplitude goes to the midline. And then down to the amplitude. So from the next one, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then goes back up to the midline. And then goes back up to the amplitude. 1, 2, 3, 4, right up here. Okay. Now, if you notice it's a little bit more stretched out because of the amplitude. Okay, so then let's go ahead and do that. It's a lot more steep, and that's okay. And trying to be as neat as possible. All right, and there it is. Okay, now what do? Well, now I have to move it, right? Well, how do I move it? Negative 0.636. Well, you're just gonna have to kind of eyeball it, guesstimate. So this is half, right? From here to here is half of a unit. Well, we got to move it negative 0.6. That's a little bit more than half. So you're just going to have to kind of eyeball it. And that's it. So we're moving to the left. So from here, let's see, 1, 2, 3. Then moves half. So 1, 2, 3. Over here is going to be negative 1/2. And that's okay. So we're just going to have to go ahead and do our best to estimate. So 1, 2, 3. Maybe a little bit more here. Okay, right over there. Same thing. This guy's going to move a little bit more than half to the left. This guy, same thing, a little bit more than half. So this is half, but a little bit more, maybe right there. Same thing here, 1, 2, 3, a little bit more than half. And this guy, 1, 2, 3, a little bit more than half right there. And you're just gonna go ahead and connect it the best that you can. Goes up like that. And this guy here. And right here. All right, guys, and there it is. Okay, let's do one last one. Okay, same thing. What's my midline? Positive 1. What's my amplitude? Positive 3. What is my period? It's 2 pi divided by whatever's in front of that b, or in front of that x. In front of the x there's a 2, so put a 2. 2 pi divided by 2, that's going to give me 1 pi. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and do our midline first. Our midline is 1. 1 is right there. Doot, doot, doot. Okay. Now that I have my 1, now I'm going to go ahead and do my period. My period is pi, so by the time I get over here, I should get to pi. So let's start off at 0. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So by the time I finish my 1 cycle, I should end up at pi. Cool. Now what about these other 3? Well, you take your pi, divide it into 4 sections, and they did it for us. Cool. So pi over 4, pi over 4, pi over 4. Nice. 1 pi over 4, so that becomes 2 pi over 4, and then that becomes 3 pi over 4, and that's 4 pi over 4. All right. And so notice that's how we're doing. We're counting 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4. The last thing is, let's go ahead and do our horizontal shift. Let's just solve it real quick. So 2x minus pi, we're going to set that equal to 0. Okay. That means 2x, when we bring it over, it becomes positive pi. Divide by 2, we get pi over 2. That means we're going to move it pi over 2 units to the right. Cool. All right, let's start graphing it. So we're dealing with cosine, so we're going to start, we don't start at the midline, we start at the amplitude. So from the midline, remember the amplitude is from the midline. We go 1, 2, 3, right up here. And then we get down to the midline. And then we go to the amplitude. So from the midline, we count 3 down. 1, 2, 3, right there. And then back up to the midline. And then from the midline, you count up 3. 1, 2, 3, right there. And there it is. All right, so we do it that way. And then the same thing over here. Okay. And okay. Last thing we got to do is do our horizontal shift. What are we doing? Pi over 2 to the right. Now this is pi over 4. Okay. Pi over 2 is the same thing as 2 pi over 4. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be moving to the right. So not only 1, but actually 2. Okay. I might run out of room, but that's okay. So let me see if I can extend this. So 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4. Then we get 5 pi over 4. And then 1, 2, which is probably barely made it, 6 pi over 4 right there. So now This guy not only moves 1, it moves 2. So right up here. This guy moves what? 2. Right here. This guy moves 2. 1, 2. And then this guy moves 2. 1, 2. And then this guy moves 2. 1, 2. And so therefore we got this right there. And then here. Whoops. And there's one cycle of your cosine wave. So hopefully that helps, guys. Hopefully you understand how we're doing this and the pattern and steps. And then so good luck, guys. See you guys next time.